So at the moment there are two levels of developments and challenges in EU foreign policy. One is at the macro level. We have a new leadership team that is redefining, rethinking some of the EU's overarching foreign policy priorities, of course promising to be more geopolitical, interestingly also promising to move up a gear in the EU support for democracy and human rights around the world. But then at a more operational level, the EU is rethinking the way it actually spends its money, its resources, and in particular how it supports civil society organizations. In that sense, we're at a moment of opportunity. It looks, in principle, as if the EU could have at its disposal more resources to support democratic reformers and human rights defenders. But there are big questions about the way that this money is actually spent and if the plans at the moment are actually moving in the right direction. So in Carnegie over the last year and a half, we've been working on a project to try and explore ways in which the EU might be able to improve the way it supports civil society organizations, in particular in the neighborhood, in the Balkans and in Turkey. We've been working with a whole range of civil society partners and policymakers to try and come up with a template for reform, ways in which the EU can be more efficient, more effective. EU policies on the ground have improved in an operational sense over recent years, but unfortunately the challenges are becoming more difficult as well. So the EU is kind of running to keep up with the seriousness, the gravity of the challenges it's facing. The challenges are very different across different countries. Some countries are opening up new opportunities. There is a growth in the civil society sector, whereas other countries have governments that are actually targeting civil society actors in a very repressive sense, and in a way doing that as part of their foreign policy pushback against the European Union and European interests. That's why we argue that there needs to be a much tighter fusing of overarching EU foreign policy priorities and strategic thinking on the one hand, and the way that the EU actually uses its resources in a much more concrete sense on the other hand. The EU seems to be moving in the direction of having perhaps just one funding instrument. So what we must see that is if the EU is moving in a direction of simplifying its funding, it does make sure that very loose, flexible, agile processes and rules still exist that do not prevent the EU from getting money to democratic reformers and to human rights organizations that could be prejudiced if the EU simplifies its funding instruments to such an extent that it kind of irons out these specificities that civil society funding needs on the ground. In the next stage of European policy, civil society around the neighborhood, the Balkans and Turkey, is looking to the EU to take a more proactive stance in defending civil society in a more systemic way, rather than simply protecting individual human rights defenders when they are already under severe danger. So I think that's the next phase, the next challenge that the EU has to meet.